And I'm going to turn my camera off because I don't need to be here.
You might need to let people in though, David.
Are they going to pop up as waiting to be admitted?
Yes, yes, it'll pop up.
100 of them?
Really?
Well, no, there are probably groups of them.
Mm.
Yes, I will watch my. I'll watch my camera. Oh, and it is recording already, so
That's fine.
it just started when I turned it on.
All right, I can see that people are joining. Welcome everybody. We're just waiting for people to log in and we'll get started with our panel discussion in a few minutes.
So I don't have to, participants, I see just the numbers.
And we're still working on some technical things in the background there.
I apparently don't have to let them in.
No, I don't think so.
That's nice.
Yeah, we have around 34 people right now. Welcome anybody who's just joining us. If you're interested, you can put your name and other information in the chat, like pronouns and professional affiliations. You don't have to, but if you want to, that might be kind of fun. And we'll get started with the panel discussion in a few minutes.
No, I don't have it set to everybody. Here.
David, maybe you should just turn off the sound though if you're just dealing with technical stuff. Oh, this is so great. I'm looking at the list of participants and I see that maybe people are starting to put names in the chat. It's great to see everybody. We'll get started with the panel discussion in a few minutes, but thanks everyone for joining. I see Northwest Science Writers Association members, new members, and longtime members. Thanks very much, and we'll get started in a few minutes. Well, that's interesting. Oh, hello, look who's showing up. This is so fantastic. It's great to see everybody. We'll get started with the panel discussion in a few minutes, but if you want to put your information in the chat, and we'll start the panel discussion on inclusive and bias-free language in a minute or so. Actually, I should do some sort of informal acknowledgements. While we're waiting for everybody to log in, welcome. And if you want to, you can put information in the chat. We'll start the panel discussion in a minute, but I wanted to give some thank yous to the Seattle Association of Black Journalists and the Native American Journalists Association. They were especially helpful in helping us find panelists. And we also got promotion for this event from those organizations, the Seattle Association of Black Journalists and Native American Journalists Association, also Asian American Journalists Association of Seattle, some Seattle freelance and editors networks at the University of Washington, and the Academic Editing Circle, and the Seattle Association for Women in Science also helped with promotion. So thanks everyone. If I missed somebody that I should acknowledge, please put that in the chat. And we'll get started with the panel discussion in a minute or so. Oh, hello everybody. Well, it's great to see everybody. We have so much to talk about. I kind of feel like maybe we should just get started. And because I've got some announcements to start with, and then as I'm talking, maybe some more people will join. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this Northwest Science Writers Association panel discussion on inclusive and bias-free language. I'm Chris Tachibana, NWSWA board member. Co-hosting is board member David Mills, who will be watching for your questions in the Q&A box. Also here to help is NWSWA Vice President Ellen Kuwana. Please note that we're recording this event. Ellen, David, and I are in the Seattle area where the Northwest Science Writers Association is based. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of Coast Salish peoples, specifically the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people who are still here. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. Here's a little information about the Northwest Science Writers Association, or NWSWA. We are more than 200 science communicators in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. We offer a mentorship program, career development grants, networking events, writing awards, a student career day, job postings, and each month we highlight the published writing of our members. Learn more about our regular, hardship, and student membership rates at our website, nwscience.org. I see the link has already appeared in the chat. Coming up this year, actually very soon, we will also have a possible follow-up event to tonight that will be on inclusiveness and science stories. We're planning a panel discussion on being a scientist and advocating for science policy, and we might have a fun science game show this summer. But tonight, our panel is here to talk about how to use and keep up with trends in inclusive and bias-free language. As communicators, we can make a meaningful contribution to inclusiveness and equity by using bias-free language and setting the tone for respectful discussions. So we're going to spend an hour answering questions that came in ahead of time when you registered, or that you can put in the Q&A box at any time. At 7 o'clock Pacific, we'll end the panel discussion because not everyone is in Pacific time, so it might start getting late. But for anyone who's interested, we're planning a separate optional Zoom event, what David is calling the after party. That'll maybe be like 30 minutes of just drop-in, informal, follow-up networking, answering questions. And so that will immediately follow the panel discussion, and we'll put a link for that separate Zoom after party in the chat at the end. So now, here to give us advice on inclusive, bias-free language are panelists Naomi Ishizaka, Polly Dennett-Claw, and Chelsea Lee. Chelsea Lee is a content development manager on the American Psychological Association Style Team. She coordinated development of the bias-free language guidelines for the most recent publication manual of the APA. She maintains and answers questions about the organization's bias-free language resources and writes for the APA Style blog. In particular, look for her Welcome Singular They entry from October. Award-winning journalist Polly Dennett-Claw is a citizen of the Navajo Nation from Manuelito, New Mexico. She is Hautsuwi Meadow people, born for Kañoani, Towering House people. Polly is the Indigenous Affairs reporter for the Texas Observer and a board member for the Native American Journalists Association. She has experience reporting on Indigenous communities, youth, LGBTQ2S+, arts and culture, education, and business. Naomi Ishizaka is the Assistant Managing Editor for Diversity, Inclusion, and Staff Development and the Social Justice Columnist for the Seattle Times. She is a journalist and photographer who focuses on racial equity and social justice. In 2020, she was awarded first place in the Best in the West competition for special topics column writing for her work in the Seattle Times. She also served 8 years as the editor-in-chief of the award-winning Colors Northwest magazine for communities of color in the Northwest. And Ellen and David had put a lot of links for the panelists' bios and more information into the chat. So let's start a discussion by talking about what we define as inclusive and bias-free language and how we decide what that is. So Chelsea, I wanted to start with you because your job is creating the guidelines that science communicators use. So tell us how your team identifies language that's biased, and then the process for going through and changing it in the APA style manual.
Thank you, Chris. I would be happy to. So as Chris mentioned, I work at the American Psychological Association and in the APA style team. And my job is to gather all of the writing and advice of people who are out there in the world doing research and working with the people who we're writing about. And so APA has guidelines for bias-free language that relate to a bunch of different personal characteristics. Among those, we have age, disability, gender, participation in research, racial and ethnic identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and then also advice on addressing intersectionality. And so the way it works is that psychologists who are APA members are all over the country and somewhere abroad as well. There are people who are on committees for each of those topics. So they're maybe working with older people, and so they're giving advice about how to talk about age, or maybe they're working with different people with people with different disabilities, and so they're giving advice about how to talk about that using identity first or person first language. So the committees give their recommendations, which are a distillation of the research. And then those recommendations come to us at the APA, and yours truly helps make it into a chapter in this book so that people can have a concise sort of introduction to the terms that they should be aware of, things to look out for, and also to get knowledge about the principles that underlie speaking and writing without bias. Because I think that once you understand the principles, it all flows from there. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting to see a little bit of, you know, the behind the scenes about where those come from and
Yeah.
how many layers there are. The APA has a really nice free resource for bias-free language. We should be sure to put that in the chat if we haven't already.
Yeah, I could stick it in. Yeah, all of the information about bias-free language from APA is available in full on our website, and I'll pop a link into the chat for that as well. I just wanted to really emphasize that it's not like a person in a room by themselves deciding. You know, the information's coming from the people themselves who are the impacted parties, who are saying, this is how I want to be referred to. This is the language I want you to use to describe me. And then our goal at APA is to say, treat people, you know, with respect and dignity, call people what they want to be called.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great, thank you. Naomi, we have a lot of producers and editors here who are using the types of style guides that Chelsea described. What does that use of style guidelines and making style decisions look like at a major newspaper?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for others, but I can talk about our process. We have an inclusive style committee, so we have a group of folks that come from different parts of the newsroom, including the copy desk, of course, who really lead that team. But the idea behind it is to what Chelsea was saying, is that when we hear from readers or we hear from community members that there's language that we're using or not using that we need to take a look at, we have a running list of terms and phrases to discuss, and we add it to that list, and we add you know, what the AP says about it, if anything. We add what we've said about it, if anything. We add some background, and then when we have our meetings, which happen about once a month, I believe, we go go through that list and talk about the different entries and really hash it out and try to bring as much of that additional context, like Chelsea was saying, to the fore. So if there's a lot of articles that have been written about it, or if even if it's something where community members have been really outspoken about it, we weigh that really heavily, and then we bring that all into the discussion. And then once we've had that discussion and we feel pretty good about it and we feel pretty solid about it, then we'll take that and sort of implement it newsroom wide by adding it to our internal style guide. And then if it's something pretty significant that we think is something that should be looked at nationwide, we might take it to one of the journals of color organizations and say, hey, I'm on the local AAJ board. So I might say to the national AAJ board, hey, this is something we might want to look at. Let's talk about this as part of a revision to our AAJ style guide as well.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask about like journalists or a writers organization. Polly, as a board member of the Native American Journalists Association, we should put the style resources link also for the Native American Journalists Association in the chat. There are just a whole page of good resources. But what's your experience with being part of a group that's making style decisions? How do you do it? Oh, yeah.
It's language is so important. And with the Native American Journalists Association, we do put out these style guides, especially for non-native news outlets, to really have a better understanding of the type of language that they use and making sure that they're minimizing harm as they're reporting on Indigenous communities. Because oftentimes what you will see in major news outlets all across the country, big newspapers, legacy newspapers, is this language of Native American tribe does this. That is inaccurate. Tribes should always be referred to by their specific name. And that's something that is very important, but you continue to see that sort of writing when it comes to headlines, when it comes to stories, and even when it comes to political candidates. It just says Native American candidate, and it's just not as accurate as it could be, because again, being Native American is not just a race or ethnicity. It's a political classification. And so that's very important to recognize when you're reporting on Indigenous communities, is that we are both citizens of our nation and citizens of the United States. And so it's very important that that distinction gets made in the language that people are using. And for us, at the Native American Journalists Association, a big thing for us too is the type of language that gets used to describe Native people, the types of scenes that are created, the language that is used around those scenes. I just cannot read another article talking about how sacred Native lands are. I can't do it. It's cringy. It plays into this stereotype of Native people. And it's just a buzzword. That's all it is anymore. And so the Native American Journalists Association, I highly recommend this guide to everyone. It's the bingo guide. And it has a list of reoccurring stereotypes and language that is in almost every single article written by a non-native news outlet. And it's, if you get a bingo, please rewrite your story. And so really that's sort of what we do at the Native American Journalists Association. And in my new role at the Indigenous Affairs Desk at the Texas Observer, we are creating our own internal style guide now. So discussing whether or not we should make the move from Native American to Indigenous. So we've been having those discussions because, as you know, Texas has a very unique history where Indigenous identity is multifaceted. It crosses borders. And so how do we then talk about that in our stories and in our newsroom? And how do we honor the identities of the people in the state of Texas? And so those are conversations that, you know, we have as I'm building out the Indigenous Affairs desk, and making sure that we are also using the language that the tribe wants us to use, being very clear about that. So yeah.
That's really helpful for us. I kind of had a follow-up question though, in general about like including tribal information. Sometimes, like you were saying in a headline, there's a really specific character count. So how do you sort of balance, you know, needing to keep within a word limit or a length limit with wanting to provide full information?
For me, that isn't really an issue because what's easier, Native American or Navajo, which is shorter? Apache, Hopi, Zuni. It's not a matter of space, it's a matter of just making that shift to language. And some readers may find it very confusing, but they'll learn as they're reading the article. And I think that Native American is just this word that has become, everyone knows what that means. And in the process of that, they don't know local tribes. And that is an issue. So if you are a newspaper in an area, newspapers should be recognizing the land that they occupy. That's a huge thing that I feel like a lot of newspapers haven't really taken on the challenge of doing, and recognizing and realizing that they occupy stolen land. And so I think it's just really important that newsrooms take that into consideration when they're reporting on these stories. The people don't know the tribes in your area because you don't use the names to report them. They're not recognizable for your readers because you don't educate them on it.
This is really great advice and a good motivation, you know, for us to do that. And I see Naomi found the bingo card link and put it in the chat. So everybody take a look at that. That's great. Thank you. I think we should move on to some of the topics that, let's see, that are in the Q&A. So put your questions in the Q&A if you want. And we also got some topics ahead of time when people registered. I think we'll get to the question of, well, I don't know, maybe we should just go to this question. Sally's question gets to a group of, a topic that was brought up about gender identity and sex. And Chelsea, I think I might start with you. As a science writers organization, a lot of us work in health related fields. And so we're interested in this really specific issue of, you know, a condition that's associated with women like pregnancy, or men like prostate cancer. How do we write that in a way that includes, you know, someone who is transgender, but is showing this, you know, what we would traditionally, you know, a transgender man breastfeeding? How do we sort of write inclusively about that?
I would say that you can't go wrong with person as a name for whoever it is, like that person who is breastfeeding, that person who's pregnant. Like, that's not so hard. I have two I have two little kids who are 6 and 3, and I use person with them whenever I talk about someone who's like out in the world. I'm like, careful you don't run into that person's shopping cart at the grocery store. They use person all the time now, just because that's what we use around them. And I think that once you that gets you a lot of the way. If you are going to be doing a more like in-depth discussion of the issues, like a lot would depend on context, because if you are talking about pregnant people and all of the pregnant people about who you're talking are women, then you should say pregnant women because that's who you're talking about, right? So a lot just depends on who are you talking about. And so, for example, I want to emphasize here that so the APA context, APA is largely used in research settings. And so we're talking about people who are doing research and they're writing journal articles that you might then see reported on in a journalism context. And so in a research context, it tends to be that you're working with specific individuals, like you surveyed 300 whomevers. And so you know who those people are because they told you. And then when you're writing in a broader context, you need to make sure that you're not changing the meaning. I think that's really important too.
I think that's kind of what we struggle with. And when the question sort of specifically says, you know, acknowledging the diversity of those who give birth, but using the word mothers at some places in the story, just because when we write, we usually want to use a mixture of words. And I think that might be kind of what you're describing is, you might be able to.
I wish it was easy. I wish there was the answer. Maybe I don't wish it, that there was the answer that you could feel like, yes, this is it. But there's not, you know, like.
Yeah, Polly.
Oh, do you want to go, Naomi?
No, go for it.
So I just wanted to add that I think that if we use the language of like mothers when we were talking about people who give birth, we reinforce the gender binary, which, as we all know, is so harmful, especially to folks who identify as non-binary or who identify as being trans. And so I would recommend that people, unless the person identifies as being a mother, that they use gender neutral terms, because oftentimes then that leaves out people who don't identify as women who do give birth. And who do have children.
And for there, you can just say parent.
Yeah, parent, exactly, like parent.
It's right there.
Who gives birth. To make sure that it does include a multitude of identities, and that we continue to push back on this restrictive language that giving birth is only for mothers or is only for people who identify as being women. And also there's a lot of women who can't have children as well. And so it's like this language of, well, you're saying that women give birth, but that's not the experience of all women. And so that also puts pressure, I feel like, on women to reproduce or have kids. And that becomes sort of like the norm. And again, we just want to recognize that some people, one, can't give birth, two, choosing not to, and three, that gender and gender identity are shifting and changing, and our language needs to change with it and to honor those voices who are so marginalized.
Thank you. Naomi, did you want to add?
Yeah, first I just want to say I agree with everything that Chelsea and Polly said. I've been thinking a lot about this, and you know, we definitely use pregnant people in our stories for the reasons that you talked about, and I'm really proud of that. I saw that in a story recently about I think diapers, and I was just so proud that we did that. And that said, I think, you know, in reflecting on this question, I've been thinking about, you know, how do we continue to make problems visible versus making them invisible, right? And I think that that's what, you know, Polly, you're bringing up around gender identity and all these nuances that are really important to include. And I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about is, you know, I think about that book. I don't know anything about the book. I just remember the title, which was The End of Men. And sometimes I think that it's actually more likely that it's like the end of women. It's like we didn't ever talk about maternal health disparities for a long period of time in our society before we're being sort of asked to say, well, let's not talk about women because that could be exclusionary. And I guess my concern is, why don't we broaden the conversation so that it includes women and includes people who are non-binary, includes trans people, includes everyone, but doesn't necessarily say we need to stop talking about women because women could be exclusionary to other people, because there's still so many things in which women are marginalized. And I think to kind of skip over the, you know, the end of women thing, to skip over women when we haven't even talked about women. Women have never been in the forefront of the conversation. We've never talked about how all these different things have impacted women differently. And then we're going to jump ahead to, well, let's just stop talking about women because that could be exclusionary. I want us to be able to talk about both, right? So pregnant women, pregnant people, like, let's make sure we don't ignore the fact that women are have disproportionate impacts on so many different things, from income gaps to mortality to all these different things that are really important to call out. And I don't want to skip over the part where we're actually naming it and calling it out.
Thank you for adding that. I think that's, I feel like I observe this dynamic that you're talking about frequently, especially about online discourse where people are almost fighting about who has the spotlight. And it's like, okay, we've talked about this group. They've had their turn. Now we need to talk about this group, and ensuring that we keep broadening what we're trying to do and to be inclusive rather than being like, rather than being not inclusive. I think that's so important. And that really all that's necessary is to explain the context of where you're coming from. And that goes a long way.
Yeah.
I don't agree with that at all. In fact, it makes me extremely uncomfortable because I feel like those are the same sort of rhetoric that gets used by trans exclusionary radical feminists. And I think that we need to be very careful about how we talk about this because cis women have always been centered in sort of when we continue to have these like conversations, right? And allowing other people into this space does not take away from the fact that we are all in this space together.
Yes.
And so it makes me very, very uncomfortable. Obviously, women are included when we say people who are pregnant.
I'm very curious about how we create language that does honor everybody and it's inclusive, but it also brings everybody along. But maybe is it possible to sort of have everybody come along at the same pace? Or are we going to see this sort of like, we focus on this set of terms and now we're focusing on the other one and eventually we're making progress? Does that make a sense, Polly, or do you think it's possible?
For me, I don't understand, like, clearly women are included in the language of pregnant people. When we think of pregnant people, we think automatically of women. And so I don't understand why that wouldn't be like a term that would be most acceptable, considering that the identity right now of who are the pregnant people is cis women. And so to use that language, not only does it recognize women, cis women, but it also recognizes people who fall outside of that, people who identify as non-binary, people who identify as being trans.
Actually, this discussion kind of brings up something that it wasn't a direct question that we got ahead of time, but it was kind of implied, which is what happens when you're working with, like you have style guides that conflict, or maybe your publication has some style guidance that it doesn't come up to your standards of inclusiveness. Naomi, has your newspaper ever encountered that? What do you do about it? Or have you as a writer maybe encountered that?
That our style guide isn't where we want it to be?
Or, that you're writing for some publication and they want you to use some term, or they want you to have some sort of style, like they want you to capitalize or not capitalize something, and that isn't, the standard that you want to use.
Yeah, that's when we would roll out our inclusive style committee to sort of say, and we do this all the time. Like we might have something that we we capitalized B in Black before AP decided to capitalize B in Black in a whole bunch of other publications. And so we just decided that was something that was important to us. And so we did that in like November of 2019. And so, yeah, we don't have any problem doing that, but we just have to have it very well grounded and very well considered and thought through.
So it sounds like that's something that that a person could raise with a publication and say, I think we should be using this term. I think we should be saying pregnant people or, okay. We've got some other questions in the chat, and I wanted to mention something that also came up around disability, language around disability, which is when there's a legal term, like, for example, handicapped, or I saw a lot of objections online to like special needs, but I think in educational settings, that is some kind of semi-official term. The question also in our Q&A is about federal level statistics, which are reported as Native American. And you know, how do we write about something when sometimes there's a specific legal or official term to use? Yeah, Polly, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so when it comes to the term American Indian, when it comes to federal Indian law, it would be most appropriate to use the language of the law. And I feel like that's the only time American Indian should be used when it comes to legal terms, or when it also comes to research within Indigenous communities. I think then when you are quoting directly from the work, I think that it's very appropriate to use the term American Indian because that's how they have chosen to utilize the information. And the participants, when they participated, that's language that they used. And so I think that is I feel like that's when it would be appropriate. But other than that, I do think that the tribe's specific name should be used. And it's really great if the surveys and the research, if it's available, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, but it's broken down by tribe. And so that's super helpful, so that you can say Navajos or people who identify as Navajos in this specific county. This is what the research is looking like, or there's this specific Navajo law. Yeah, and so sometimes the research does look like that. And so if it does, it would be most appropriate to do it by the tribe.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, Chelsea, also with like disabilities, mental health conditions or something in the APA style manual, what's your guidance about using like legal terms?
I completely agree with what Polly was saying. I think that your language, it makes sense for it to match the sources that you're talking about. If you're talking about a census category or survey results and you change the words, if someone went to look at that source and verify the information, or they wanted to find out more and all the terms were different, that would be confusing. So I think that the official designations are one thing, but the more distinctions that are relevant to the APA guidelines have to do with, I guess, like distinguishing between things like person first language and identity first language is really relevant. And then additionally, just knowing sort of what terminology has existed over time, and then what is the most current terminology that is being used. And some terms that used to be okay, it's not okay anymore, and the people need to keep growing, keep changing, so that they can keep treating people the way that they deserve to be treated, which is with respect.
I was hoping that you would explain person first versus identity first language.
I'd be happy to. Okay, so person first language means a construction such as you might say a person with epilepsy. So you have the wording person with blank. Identity first has got an adjective before the noun. So you might say an autistic person versus person with autism. It tends to be that different communities have, broadly speaking, different preferences about what kind of language they prefer. And then individual people have individual preferences about what language that they prefer. So our guidance is that in general, both person first and identity first language are intended to respect people. So that's good. And that both of them are fine choices, and you can use either of them, you can mix them, unless or until you know that a person or a community prefers one, and then you should use that one. So usually this requires either, if you're working directly with people, you would ask them what language they want, or if you're writing about a topic but you're not like working directly with people, you can do things like look at self-advocacy groups to say what language have they put out there in the world that they say this is how I want to be referred to. And I feel like most communities have an opinion, and it tends to vary based on how much of part of your identity that disability is. And so if you consider it part of who you are, then you're more likely to use identity first language. This is what it boils down to.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting distinction. Naomi, you've probably encountered this in interviewing like people all over the place. What do you do if you have a story and you've interviewed different people and some of them are using identity first identification, or how do you then write your story?
Yeah, I mean, our default with pretty much all things is to respect and honor however the person chooses to identify. And so that solves, a big chunk of the issue, for the reasons that Chelsea said. And we actually have another thing that we do called Community Voices, where we bring in community members to discuss, from a community perspective, issues that are important to them or important to us that we need to understand better as a staff. And one of the ones that we did was on language related to disability, and we had this very conversation. And one of the things that the presenter talked to us about was that there's in-group language, there's outside group language, and then there's sort of journalism style, and that you have to sort of navigate the different audiences and who you're speaking to. And her guidance was that because we're not an in-group, it's not appropriate to use identity first language in the same way that she might if she was talking to someone else who's part of the disabled community, as she would consider it. So we use person first language in that case based on her advice and guidance and other learnings that we've done. But if I were to identify her herself, which I have, I use the way that she identifies, which is identity first.
That's interesting. I think okay, just as sort of an example of how it's never as simple as you think, I'm going to put Polly on the spot to tell us about, you wrote an article for the Texas Observer about Indigenous identity, about tribal identity, and it was so eye-opening. So I think we put it in the chat already, but we should put it in again, and everybody should go read this entire article. But could you give us a little bit of a summary of it?
Yeah, so the summary of the article is that you can't identify as being Native American without then providing what community you're from. And so in the story that I reported on, there was a woman who did identify as being Native American, who had linked herself to a tribe in my state, which is Mescalero Apache. And so I found out later that she had no living ties to the community. And what that means is she doesn't have family who lives there. She didn't have any sort of like cultural relationship with the tribe. She didn't have political ties either, because there are some folks who do have a connection to the tribe, but don't necessarily have a strong familial relationship. For whatever reason, there's various reasons how that disconnect happens. But really, when it comes to reporting on people who identify as being Native American, they do have to have ties to a living community. And so that is, like I said, being Native American is a political identity. It's a recognition of a political identity. And so in that piece, I tried to be, and when I do report on this, I try to be as fair and as accurate as possible, because identity is so tricky and there are so many layers. And so many people have been kicked out of tribes. And so really in my reporting, I just look for a connection to a tribe, a connection to a living Indigenous community. And however they choose to share that with me is what I accept. Whether it's, I'm not enrolled because I don't meet blood quantum, but I'm Native American, that person is Indigenous, that person's Native. If there's someone who got disenrolled, again, we also have our freedmen relatives who are not recognized by the tribes. And that one is not right. And so it's just, Indigenous identity is so layered. And when we report on Indigenous communities, it's very important that you look back at those layers and peel them away, to really discover the connections and ties or the histories. I did quote Dr. Kim Tallbear, and she had a really wonderful quote where she said, our relatives who are not enrolled understand why they're not enrolled. And so, it's just a very simple, easy explanation, but they do have to have ties to a living community. Whatever that tie may be, those are the questions that need to be asked when you are reporting on Indigenous communities is, okay, what community do you come from? Do you have ties to your relatives there? Do you have cultural ties? Do you have political ties to the tribe? And really uncovering those answers. It's really not about policing Indigenous identity. It's asking how you are connected to those communities, to making sure that, the resources that are meant for Indigenous people are going to Indigenous people. And I think that is so important. And again, just being kind and understanding and really leaning on the side of grace and allowing grace for people is how I choose to do my reporting. And so there's just like, in my article, I do a better job of sort of listing out the questions that I ask when I'm trying to identify how this person is connected to the tribe that they say that they're from.
Thank you. It's really worth a read because it is really good. That was a good explanation, but the article is also really informative. We simply have to address this one set of terms, which has been the number one request for explanations, and it probably also sort of gets into the very layers and nuances of identifications, and that, of course, is Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latina, Chicano, Chicana. I'm just wondering if maybe Naomi, you could start us off. Like, what do you see as preferences for use of those terms?
Yeah, this was a really good learning experience for us, in the sense that we have as I said, a group of folks that work on on these things, and we're pretty, you know, tapped into what folks in the community, especially those that are working on racial justice issues, feel. And so we had started seeing Latinx being used much more frequently, and we started talking about using it ourselves, and we got really far down that path, and I started using it in my columns. Other folks started using it in their writing, and then we got a whole bunch of feedback from our readers and the community, from folks that identified as part of the Latinx community, who said that, one, they hated the term, two, they didn't understand the term, three, they thought we got way ahead of ourselves with using this term, that as we've learned later, Pew found that only 3% of people in the Latinx community actually use that term, and about 1 in 4 have ever heard of it. So I think it was a really good and humbling lesson for us, that while we are sitting in this world where we're very conscious of how we're using language and thinking that we're doing something that's really pushing the ball forward, the folks that we're supposedly doing that for did not agree with that at all. And there was so much difference of opinion around what the alternative would be or should be, that we just kind of had to go back to square one a little bit on it, and really, roll back the use of Latinx, really start thinking more deeply about what the best way is to incorporate the very, very divergent views of the folks that reached out to us. And I think that's the important part, is that, I think there's folks in certain sectors, especially in academia, where, they've come to an agreement upon themselves, but there wasn't really a memo that was dispersed out to the rest of the community. I don't know if we're going to talk about BIPOC, but I think that's another example of this phenomenon. And I think there's a certain elitism that we have to be really mindful of and really wary of. And I think another sort of meta thing that I wanted to say is that I think we have to be really careful about, our sanctimony around these things. And I think it's very easy to get sanctimonious because we're the people who know the right way. We're the people that can tell you the right way and to tell you the way you should think about this and be. And the reality is, we're a newspaper that's supposed to represent, in the same way that Chelsea's talking about, person first language. It is not respectful or honoring to call people something that they don't identify with or doesn't actually align with their own personal identity. And so that's something that we have to put our own egos in check, and our own sense of we want to be on the vanguard of doing the right thing, and say, okay, well, what is the actual right thing? We don't really know at this point. And I think we're at the don't really know at this point. And if somebody does know, I'd love to know.
Well, Chelsea educated me about some emerging terms. So yeah, I think we don't know, but what are you seeing, Chelsea?
Well, there are compelling arguments for Latino, Latina with the A sign, for Latinx. There's compelling arguments for all of them. And the advice that we give at APA is, again, working directly with the people who you're talking about and being like, which of these terms is the one for you specifically? And to also encourage writers to explain why they choose the words that they choose. For example, with a term like Latinx that a lot of people haven't heard of, and it's coming from this, the people who are more likely to have heard of it are college educated white people, but then also the term has origins in the queer community of people who are saying Latino and Latina don't represent me. I want something else that because maybe these people have non-binary gender or other gender, and they want a term that isn't gendered. And so in some cases, for APA, Latinx is offered as a gender neutral term from that perspective. And so, but again, remember that the work that is being produced with APA style is largely research rather than journalism, which is being consumed by everyday people.
So Polly, is someone who's interviewing people across the Southwest. What kind of light can you shed on these terms for us?
Yeah, so for me, the Latinx term is actually deeply rooted in community. And so it may be a little bit different because I am in the Southwest where there is a huge Hispanic, Chicanx, Latinx community here, and a lot of organizing work that happens in my state. And so the first time that I ever heard about the term Latinx was from the community, and was from trans and non-binary people who identify as being Latinx, and they do that intentionally. And again, also these like people are not college educated. They're just community organizers who are working in their communities, and they have chosen to challenge the binary language of Spanish. And so they choose to use the term Latinx. And so I defer to them and to their expertise as people in my community, on what they choose to use. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, I defer to the experts in my community, and how they choose to identify as being part of that community, and also challenging the notions of the gender binary. And I think that when we do talk about this, you know, the gender binary is a colonial structure, and it's so deeply ingrained in the United States and, you know, around the world. But for my community and for my people being Dene, gender was not binary, and we were forced into the system of gender being binary. There were multiple genders in my tribe. We talk about it all the time. It's very well known that within Indigenous communities that there aren't these notions of the gender binary, that it didn't exist pre-contact. And so in my work, I continue to try to openly challenge the work to continuously challenge the gender binary and the language that we use that feeds into that structure. And being in community with two-spirit, trans, queer, non-binary folks, I, as an ally, continue to defer to them and their expertise, and what makes them feel most safe, most recognized. And that's the language that I choose to use in my reporting.
Yeah, thank you. Other panelists, any other insights on that topic? Are there any other racial, cultural, ethnic communities that have, you know, this many emerging terms, do you think? Or is this really sort of the one that everybody is having trouble with right now?
I just wanted to flag before we run out of time the
Yeah.
issue of Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. I
Yeah.
wrote a column about this that was in effort to amplify the work and the words of some of my Pacific Islander community members who have been saying for a very, very long time that aggregating Asian American and Pacific Islander makes no sense and is obscuring the lived experiences and realities and needs of the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community. And so been working hard, and it's almost May, and they've just sort of re-upped their call to ask Asian American organizations that are primarily Asian American led and prioritize Asian American issues to stop calling themselves API or APA, because what it continues to do is hide the very needs and self-determination and all the different nuances of the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander experience into this sort of big boat that doesn't fit. And so I want to raise that up here because we're talking about language and we're about to get into May, and it's just rampant, and people, because they've been talking so much about the land of killings, people finally are like, oh, Asian Americans, you are real. But they're just reflexively going into this API thing. And I think it's a really good time for us to to stop what we're doing, think about this, listen to Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders who are saying to stop doing this and really honor their wishes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And there was actually a question, I think, in the Q&A that got a little bit to this about making some top-down recognition for Indigenous identity. They also mentioned, the Asian lexicon that, at the census level and things like that, that's what we might kind of need to change, although wow, that sounds like it's going to take a long time, based on the efforts that you've described. We really just have like another minute, and I did want to close on time. There is a question about the term BIPOC, which you raised, Naomi. Do you want to really quickly tell us about that?
Yeah, BIPOC is another example, like Latinx, where we went ahead and used it, and gotten a ton of feedback from folks, and increasingly been hearing back from community as well that that not just our readers don't understand it, but the folks that it was intended to center, Black and Indigenous folks, very much object to it as well for different reasons. But we don't have time to get into all the reasons, but there's a multitude of reasons, and I think that there's not necessarily a decision on that. For our point, we're still using it in different ways, but we try to always explain what it means. But the main point that I've heard a lot of my Black community members and friends talk about is that if you're talking about the Black community, talk about the Black community, name the Black community. Don't just create this huge bucket that then everyone, it's the same kind of issue with Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian. Like, say what you mean, be as clear as you can be, name what you're saying. Don't just hide behind this like big, sort of shield of language. So I think being as specific as possible is a great first step there.
Thank you. Yeah, Polly, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, well, I guess for me, I do agree that if it's issues that affect the Black community, to just say that it's the Black community, like this is affecting the Black community, and sort of hiding behind this ambiguous language and alluding to like these issues. And with Indigenous communities, because again, like Naomi said, BIPOC was really created to sort of center Black and Indigenous people, because our issues are very complex, and they have their own, they have additional issues, and to acknowledge that in terms of like, for Indigenous people, the political identity and the political relationship that we have with the United States. And really making sure that that is being honored, and that experience is clear. And I use BIPOC when I'm talking about like structural racism that affects like Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And they do affect us differently. But as a general rule, that's like how I do it on almost like just Twitter, basically. And so like if I'm talking about systemic issues of racism within newsrooms, I'll say like by POC, because I think it's a term that recognizes and honors like our own experience, like all of our experiences of structural racism within newsrooms and within media. And so that's when I choose to use that term. But again, like just being as specific as possible. If you're talking about issues with folks who identify as being Hispanic, or who identify as being Mexican, or who, these specific terms are most important to use over these ambiguous and general terms that we are using. So I think that is really important.
I like the advice, like say what you mean, be specific, be clear. So I think on that, we will have to thank our panelists, Naomi and Chelsea and Polly. Thank all of you for coming. I'm going to put the link for this informal after party. Oh, there it is. If you are interested in just joining us for informal follow-up and chat, then log out of this Zoom, wait a minute and log into the other one. We'll be there in a minute. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the panelists, and good night.
Hi, thank you.